I wanted to share with you this extremely sturdy workbench build that I did so that you can do it too if this is something that you would like. It has a lower shelf and of course the upper butcher block top with a vise mounted to it, and this thing is rock solid and really heavy, which is exactly what I wanted for something that's nice that I can use for years to come. So you're going to want some 4x4s, 2x4s, some of these metal angle brackets. I'm going to include those in a link below so you can get them for yourself, and then I'm going to also include some of the dimensions of my cuts and the sizing of this, as well as some of the bolts and all of that so you can build this exactly yourself. Now these only came in green, so I did have to sand them down and spray paint them with this cool looking gray metal paint. This metal paint is extremely durable. I put a couple of thick coats on there to make them look really nice. But then after I've done my cuts, I'm just dry fitting everything together to make sure it looks like the appropriate size and that it matches the butcher block top which I purchased. And so that was the first piece that you're gonna want to size out, of course, and you're gonna want about a 1-inch overhang on the edges there. As I'm dry fitting, I am marking where all of the drill holes are going to be for these angle brackets, and then I adjust my drill press accordingly. You technically don't need a drill press. It's very difficult to get perfectly perpendicular drills with a hand drill, so I certainly do recommend using a drill press here. One of my processes here is not only do I make a box, but I also mark the middle so I can ensure that I get an accurate hole, and I also only clamp the back. This lets me kind of swivel the part back and forth to make it a lot easier to quickly align for my next hole. Now my drill press and bit couldn't quite go through the entire 4x4, so I just drill as far as I can to get a good starter hole, and then I finished it up using my actual hand drill. So this is the bit that I used. It's a 13 and 32nd inch bit. Technically the one that was on the drill press I think was a 3/8 inch bit, which was actually too stiff to get the bolts to slide through, so the 13 by 32 drill bit worked perfect to let me just push these right on in to get them to fit in the little square peg there. You can't rotate these all the way because, again, like I mentioned, there is that little square box there at the bottom of the nut to ensure it's easy to just push on through. But we repeat this process for the 2x4 as well, of course, and once again I am dry fitting each part to just do a sanity check on all my cuts before pushing all my bolts in and assembling it. Now I'm not cranking any of these bolts down because we have a fair bit of dry fitting and adjusting things as we go. Later on in the build we do remove a couple of the boards to allow for the plywood to fit and so on and so forth. So we're just tightening them up to be hand tightened as we continue making our cuts and our pre-drill holes. So I just continue this process until we get the whole thing framed out. And then as far as my angle brackets for the shelf, in the images it shows them facing down, but I actually like the look of them facing up. It makes it feel more symmetrical because they're both pointing inwards. Doesn't really matter. I'm not speccing this shelf for thousands of pounds. Now one thing to keep in mind is that with the angle brackets, you're gonna wanna ensure that you mark the front corner, just so that when you remove the bolts and you pull the 4x4 out to pre-drill, that you don't get your angle bracket holes on the wrong side by accidentally rotating it when you're doing that. So do mark the outer edge before you drill to ensure that you're aligning it properly so that you don't reinstall your 4x4 and realize that your bracket is now facing the wrong corner. Once I get these pre-drilled, I realign them along with the 2x4s at the base and then mount the brackets for the shelf. I then continue my process again where I'm dry fitting each part before I pre-drill the holes, assemble them to hand tighten, and repeat until I get the second layer shelled out. I then actually tighten them with a wrench a little bit more to ensure that I can adjust it to get 90-degree angles before I do my cross braces, which again I cut, dry fit, and then I'm using these 3-inch screws and clamps. I do pre-drill as always because I want to ensure they don't crack anything. And once I get those cross braces in and ensure it's at a 90-degree angle, I crank everything down and then flip the table over so that I can then begin measuring and cutting my plywood. I did install some heavy-duty feet underneath this. It's a single screw. I didn't quite film that. Very easy to do. Just gonna ensure that the table legs are not directly on the concrete. But once I measure out the plywood, I go ahead and cut it, and then I notch all the corners for those 4x4s so that it can fit in there. You can use a knife or chisel to just kind of round out those edges, and then it ended up fitting just right. I did give an extra 1/8 of an inch on all my corners because wood naturally has a little bit of warps or things twist. Doesn't quite fit, and so that worked out great here. And I did have to remove a 2x4 in this process to be able to get the plywood to sit down there. So again, this is when it's nice having these bolts because you can just pop the parts off and then crank them back down again. So I repeat the process like I did below with the 3 cross braces. I put them at the top now, and that's gonna support the butcher block. Now we're just gonna attach the plywood to the frame of the cross beams using some 2.5-inch screws. I'm then applying my gloss polyurethane coat. I put 3 coats on the bottom, 4 coats on top, and then we're gonna go ahead and mount the vise. Now I'm mounting the vise before I actually screw the top down because I want to ensure that I'm not going to collide with that 4x4 below it. So I'm using some 3/8 inch bolts here, pre-drill once I figure out the orientation for my vise, and then I can mount it. If you have a vise that rotates, not laterally like this one does, this one rotates left and right fine, but I mean one that rotates so that you could have a part clamped from here to the floor type thing, you would want to make sure that you have clearance so that your vise can of course do that. You want to make sure that at least one side is close enough to the edge to do that. Since this one does not rotate, it's fine for me to be able to put this further inwards. Next, I'm going to screw the top down with these 3-inch screws, doing 3 on the long sides, 2 on the short sides. I do pre-drill these holes, and I also countersink the heads so that I can take a 3/8 inch dowel and add a little bit of wood glue, slice them off at the base, a little bit of sanding, and you might scuff up the table here and there. You can just sand and apply more polyurethane. That's what I'll do to wrap up these parts here. But this is a workbench, so I don't need it to be super polished. Inevitably, this thing is going to be covered with dings, scratches, cuts, epoxy, all that stuff as I work on it. So I'm not at all worried about making this perfectly smooth. So the screws provide that clamping strength, and if you wanted even more lateral strength against shifting of the tabletop, you could insert 1/2-inch dowels directly through into that 4x4 below it. That's not necessary here. This table is still super strong, so I'm not going to add those in here. So I hope that you guys enjoyed this build. I'm looking forward to being able to use this workbench for my future projects going forward. It's long overdue. If you enjoyed this watch, do click the like button or leave a comment if you have any thoughts or suggestions as always. But thanks guys so much for watching, and I will see you guys in my next build.